plate boundary configurations beneath the ocean define the spatial framework of the seafloor. Divergent, convergent, and transform margins are distributed across basin interiors and edges according to consistent geometric patterns. These configurations remain mapped within global reference systems that describe their position without requiring surface visibility. The divergent boundary category refers to a class of plate boundaries identified by the relative separation of adjacent lithospheric plates in mapped classifications. Within oceanic settings, this category is recognized as a distinct boundary type based on consistent spatial labeling across global plate maps. The classification is applied independently of local variability in crustal form or surface expression. In boundary type frameworks, divergent boundaries are grouped separately from convergent and transform categories. The distinction is maintained through standardized cartographic conventions used in marine geoscience references. These boundaries are commonly associated with linear features traced across oceanic regions, forming continuous or segmented boundary lines on tectonic charts. The divergent category is applied broadly across multiple ocean basins, without dependence on basin size or geographic position. Labels appear in both central and peripheral oceanic areas, where plate separation is identified in classification datasets. The category remains stable across revisions of global plate boundary models. In reference atlases, divergent boundaries are typically denoted using uniform symbols or color schemes to maintain consistency. These symbols distinguish the category without embedding assumptions about activity levels or temporal variation. The classification remains descriptive rather than interpretive. Divergent boundary categorization does not the progress of suffering when flying behind them. The label functions as a positional identifier within a broader boundary taxonomy. Inclusion in this category reflects boundary type recognition rather than explanatory interpretation. Across comparative plate boundary systems, the divergent category serves as one of the primary organizational divisions. Its use supports systematic mapping and cross-referencing among global datasets. The category persists as a stable element in oceanic plate boundary classification schemes. Convergent boundary category designates a class of plate boundaries identified through classification systems used in global oceanic mapping. The category is defined by the recognized relationship between adjacent plates as recorded in standardized boundary datasets. Its use reflects categorical assignment rather than descriptive detail. In boundary taxonomies, convergent boundaries are separated from divergent and transform categories as a primary division. This separation is maintained consistently across tectonic reference models and marine geoscience atlases. The category label appears uniformly in regional and global compilations. Oceanic convergent boundaries are recorded across multiple basins and margin settings. Their placement within classification schemes does not depend on basin geometry, depth range, or proximity to continental landmasses. The cartographic representations employ distinct symbols, line styles, or color codes to indicate convergent boundaries. These visual markers are standardized to allow comparison across datasets without embedding interpretive content. Symbol usage remains stable across successive mapping revisions. The convergent boundary category functions as a positional and relational identifier. It does not require reference to structural development, material properties, or temporal behavior. Inclusion in this category signals recognition within a boundary type framework rather than an explanatory model. Across comparative classification systems, the convergent category retains a fixed role as one of the principal boundary groupings. Its persistence supports consistency in global plate inventories and reference charts. The category continues to serve as a foundational element in oceanic plate boundary classification. Transform boundary category denotes a class of plate boundaries identified through formal classification systems used in oceanic plate mapping. The category is assigned based on recognized boundary relationships recorded in standardized global data sets. Its application reflects categorical placement rather than descriptive detail. Within boundary type taxonomies, transform boundaries are maintained as a distinct grouping alongside divergent and convergent categories. This separation is preserved across major tectonic reference models and marine geoscience compilations. The category label appears consistently in both regional charts and global inventories. Oceanic transform boundaries are documented across a wide range of basin settings. Their inclusion in the transform category does not depend on basin scale, geographic latitude, or proximity to continental margins. The category remains applicable wherever transform relationships are identified within mapping conventions. Cartographic representations use specific line styles, symbols, or color assignments to indicate transform boundaries. These visual conventions are standardized to support comparison across datasets without embedding interpretive assumptions. Symbol usage remains stable across successive revisions of plate boundary maps. The transform boundary category functions as a positional and relational identifier within boundary classification frameworks. It does not require reference to physical behavior, structural development, or temporal characteristics. Assignment to this category signals recognition within an established boundary type system, rather than an explanatory description. Across comparative plate classification schemes, the transform category retains a fixed role as one of the principal boundary divisions. Its continued use supports consistency in global plate boundary documentation and cross-referencing. The category persists as a stable element in oceanic boundary type classification. Mixed-type boundary zones refer to classified regions where more than one boundary category is identified within a contiguous mapped area. These zones are recognized in plate boundary classification systems to accommodate spatial overlap or adjacency of distinct boundary labels. The designation reflects categorical complexity rather than a separate boundary type. In oceanic plate maps, mixed-type zones are recorded where boundary segments display differing categorical assignments along their extent. The classification allows multiple boundary labels to be associated with a single zone, without prioritizing one category over another. This approach supports consistent representation in global datasets. Mixed type zones are applied across a range of ocean basin settings. Their identification does not depend on basin scale, geographic location, or proximity to continental regions. The category remains applicable wherever classification schemes identify boundary transitions or combined labeling requirements. Cartographic conventions represent mixed-type boundary zones using composite symbols, patterned line styles, or annotated segments. These visual treatments distinguish mixed classification from single-category boundaries. Symbol standards are selected to maintain clarity without introducing interpretive detail. The mixed type category functions as an organizational solution within boundary taxonomies. It permits accurate labeling where strict separation into a single category is not maintained in reference datasets. The designation avoids expansion into descriptive characterization beyond categorical assignment. Across comparative plate boundary inventories, mixed type zones are retained to preserve alignment between regional studies and global compilations. Their inclusion supports cross-referencing among datasets with differing resolution or mapping emphasis. The category remains a stable element in boundary type classification frameworks used for oceanic plate mapping. Transitional boundary classifications identify boundary segments that are assigned provisional or intermediate labels within plate boundary taxonomies. These classifications are used in oceanic mapping systems to denote areas where categorical assignment varies across datasets or mapping resolutions. The designation reflects classification status rather than physical characterization. In global plate inventories, transitional classifications appear where boundary labeling changes along a mapped segment or between adjacent reference models. The classification allows boundary segments to be recorded without forcing alignment to a single fixed category. This approach supports continuity across datasets compiled using differing criteria. Transitional classifications are applied across multiple ocean basins and geographic settings. Their use is independent of basin geometry, mapped extent, or regional naming conventions. The classification remains applicable wherever boundary labels show limited consistency among reference sources. Cartographic representations of transitional boundaries often employ modified symbols, annotations, or supplementary labels. These visual treatments distinguish transitional classifications from fully assigned boundary categories. The intent is to preserve informational accuracy without introducing interpretive content. The transitional boundary classification functions as an organizational category within boundary type frameworks. It accommodates uncertainty or variation in categorical labeling while maintaining inclusion within global plate maps. The designation avoids extension into descriptive or explanatory territory. Across comparative classification systems, transitional categories provide a mechanism for aligning regional studies with global compilations. Their inclusion supports cross-referencing among datasets with different levels of detail or mapping emphasis. Transitional classifications persist as a stable component of boundary type taxonomies used for oceanic plate boundary documentation. Boundary type distribution schema refers to the standardized representation of how classified plate boundary categories are arranged across oceanic regions in reference datasets. The schema functions as an organizational framework that records the spatial occurrence of boundary types without attributing behavior or development. Its purpose is categorical alignment across mapping systems. In oceanic plate inventories, distribution schemas present divergent, convergent, transform, mixed, and transmission classifications as discrete mapped elements. These elements are arranged according to established cartographic conventions that prioritize consistency and comparability. The schema applies uniformly across global and regional scales. Distribution schemas do not depend on basin naming, coordinate systems, or projection choices. Boundary types are positioned according to their recorded locations in source datasets, rather than interpretive grouping. The schema remains compatible with multiple map resolutions and compilation standards. In many reference models, distribution is summarized through global maps, tabulated listings, or digital layers. These representations show relative placement and continuity of boundary categories across oceanic areas. The schema supports aggregation without altering original category assignments. The boundary type distribution schema maintains separation between classification and interpretation. It does not incorporate statements about boundary behavior, temporal persistence, or structural attributes. The schema records presence and arrangement only. Across comparative datasets, distribution schemas provide a column reference structure. They allow boundary type labels to be compared, merged, or cross-indexed between studies. This function supports dataset interoperability without expanding categorical definitions. The schema persists as a stable component of boundary type classification practice. Its use supports systematic documentation of oceanic plate boundaries across institutional and disciplinary contexts. Mid-ocean ridge alignments refer to the geographic placement of elongated ridge systems mapped across the floors of major ocean basins. These alignments are recorded as continuous or segmented linear features that extend for thousands of kilometers across open ocean regions. Their positions are documented through global bathymetric and tectonic reference maps. In spatial placement frameworks, mid-ocean ridges are typically situated near the central portions of ocean basins. They form interconnected networks that span the Atlantic, Pacific, Indian, and Southern Oceans. The alignments are not constrained to a single latitude range and occur across equatorial, mid-latitude, and high-latitude regions. Ridge alignments often display consistent directional trends over long distances. North-south orientations are prominent in some basins. West or curved trajectories are recorded in others. These orientation patterns are catalogued as geographic attributes rather than functional descriptions. Global mapping datasets represent mid-ocean ridge alignments as linked segments rather than isolated features. Gaps, offsets, and junctions are shown as part of the mapped layout, without attributing significance beyond spatial placement. The alignments maintain continuity across basin interiors and intersect with other mapped boundary features at defined locations. In ocean basin spatial placement classifications, mid-ocean ridges serve as reference structures for organizing large-scale seafloor geometry. Their mapped positions provide consistent anchors for comparing basin layouts across different cartographic projections. The alignments remain stable elements in geographic inventories. Across institutional datasets and atlases, mid-ocean ridge alignments are recorded using standardized line symbols and naming conventions. These records emphasize location, extent, and orientation only. The classification preserves spatial clarity without extending into temporal or activity-based interpretation. Trench-associated boundary zones refer to the geographic placement of linear trench features identified along specific margins of ocean basins. These zones are mapped as narrow, elongated regions that trace the edges of plates in contact along basin peripheries. Their positions are documented consistently across global tectonic and bathymetric references. In ocean basin spatial placement frameworks, trench-associated zones are commonly located adjacent to continental margins or along island arc systems. They form continuous or semi-continuous arcs that parallel coastlines or chain-like landforms. The placement emphasizes lateral position relative to basin interiors rather than vertical form. Trench-associated zones occur prominently around the margins of the Pacific Ocean and in selected regions of the Indian and Atlantic Oceans. which their geographic distribution is uneven across basins, reflecting differences in basin boundary configuration rather than basin size. These zones are catalogued as peripheral features within basin-scale maps. Mapping datasets represent trench-associated zones as clearly delineated lines or bands. Their extents are traced along basin edges with attention to curvature and continuity. Interruptions or segmentation are recorded as part of spatial layout without interpretive annotation. Within spatial placement classifications, trench-associated boundary zones serve as reference elements for defining basin outlines. Their mapped locations provide contrast to centrally located ridge systems. This distinction supports comparative assessment of basin geometry across different ocean regions. Standard atlases and digital layers employ consistent symbols and naming conventions for trench-associated zones. These records focus on location, orientation, and extent only. The classification preserves geographic clarity while excluding references to change, activity, or boundary behavior. Fracture zone corridors refer to elongated linear features mapped across ocean basin floors as part of large-scale spatial placement frameworks. These corridors are recorded as laterally extensive zones that extend across broad areas of the seafloor. Their placement is documented through global bathymetric and tectonic mapping programs. In ocean basin spatial placement schemes, fracture zone corridors are commonly oriented roughly perpendicular to adjacent ridge alignments. They traverse basin interiors and often span significant longitudinal distances. Their geographic extent is emphasized over local variability in surface form. Fracture zone corridors are identified in all major ocean basins. Prominent examples are mapped across the Atlantic, Pacific, and Indian Oceans. Their distribution reflects basin-scale structural layout rather than regional naming conventions. Mapping datasets represent fracture zone corridors as continuous or segmented linear traces. These traces may intersect other mapped boundary features while retaining distinct corridor identities. Intersections are recorded as spatial relationships rather than functional connections. Within spatial placement classifications, fracture zone corridors provide reference lines for organizing seafloor geometry. Their mapped positions contribute to the subdivision of basin interiors into recognizable regions. This role supports consistent comparison across different cartographic projections. Fracture zone corridors are frequently arranged in parallel sets within individual basins. Spacing between corridors varies by region and is recorded as a geographic attribute. Orientation and alignment are catalogued without reference to origin or modification. Standard atlases and digital layers apply uniform symbols and labels to fracture zone corridors. These conventions prioritize clarity of placement and continuity. The classification records location, extent, and orientation only. Across institutional datasets, fracture zone corridors remain stable elements of ocean basin spatial inventories. Their inclusion supports coherent representation of large-scale seafloor patterns. The placement framework remains independent of temporal or activity-based considerations. Basin-scale boundary networks refer to the integrated spatial arrangement of multiple plate boundary segments mapped across an entire ocean basin. These networks are documented as connected systems rather than isolated features, emphasizing geographic continuity at basin scale. Their representation is derived from compiled tectonic and bathymetric reference datasets. Within ocean basin spatial placement frameworks, boundary networks extend across basin interiors, margins, and transitional zones. Ridge alignments, trench-associated zones, and fracture zone corridors appear as linked components within a single mapped network. The placement highlights overall pattern and connectivity without attributing functional relationships. Basin-scale networks differ in configuration among major oceans. The Atlantic displays a relatively continuous central network, while the Pacific shows extensive peripheral networks around basin margins. But the Indian Ocean presents intersecting networks with varied orientations. These distinctions are accorded as geographic distributions rather than comparative evaluations. Mapping conventions depict basin-scale boundary networks using continuous line systems or layered digital representations. Individual boundary segments are shown as parts of larger assemblies spanning thousands of kilometers. Junctions and intersections are represented as spatial nodes without interpretive annotation. In spatial placement classifications, basin-scale networks provide a framework for organizing regional boundary features into coherent basin-wide layouts. This organization supports consistent comparison of basin geometry across global maps. The network concept functions as a cartographic tool rather than a descriptive model. Standard atlases and digital plate boundary layers apply uniform symbology across entire networks. Naming conventions emphasize basin association and extent. These records focus on location, alignment, and connectivity only. Across institutional datasets, basin-scale boundary networks remain stable reference structures. Their inclusion supports integrated visualization of ocean basin layouts. The classification preserves geographic context while excluding temporal change and activity. Continental margin adjacency refers to the geographic placement of oceanic plate boundaries in close spatial association with continental edges. These adjacencies are recorded where mapped boundary segments parallel, intersect, or closely follow the outlines of continental margins. The classification emphasizes relative position rather than structural interaction. In ocean basin spatial placement frameworks, continental margin adjacency is identified along the peripheries of major land masses. Boundary segments appear offset slightly seaward from coastlines, or aligned along continental slopes and rises. The mapped proximity remains consistent across multiple cartographic sources. Such adjacency is common around the Pacific Rim, where boundary lines trace long arcs near continental and island margins. Comparable patterns are also documented along parts of the Indian Ocean margins and selected regions of the Atlantic. Distribution varies by basin, but remains a recognized geographic arrangement. Mapping datasets represent continental margin adjacency using boundary lines that visually parallel continental outlines. Curvature and spacing are recorded to reflect geographic alignment rather than functional association. Interruptions or changes in distance from the margin are shown as part of spatial layout. Within basin-scale placement classifications, continental margin adjacency provides a means of distinguishing peripheral boundary arrangements from centrally located features. This distinction supports clear organization of basin interiors versus margins in global maps. The classification remains descriptive and positional. Standard atlases and digital boundary layers apply consistent symbology to margin-adjacent boundaries. Naming conventions often reference nearby continental regions or coastal arcs. These records focus on location, orientation, and extent only. Across institutional datasets, continental margin adjacency remains a stable spatial category. Its inclusion supports comparative mapping of ocean basin edges across different regions. The placement framework excludes references to change, activity, or boundary behavior. Open ocean boundary fields refer to geographic regions where plate boundary segments are positioned far from continental margins and basin edges. These fields are mapped across expansive areas of the ocean interior, emphasizing distance from land masses rather than boundary behavior. Their identification is based on spatial placement in global tectonic and bathymetric datasets. In ocean basin spatial placement frameworks, open ocean boundary fields occupy central or intermediate basin areas. Boundary segments in these fields are distributed across broad seafloor regions without direct alignment to continental outlines. The placement highlights separation from margin-associated boundary zones. Open ocean fields are prominent in the Central Atlantic, Indian, and parts of the Pacific basins. Their geographic distribution varies by basin geometry, but remains a recognized category across global maps. These fields are recorded wherever boundary networks extend across open basin interiors. Mapping conventions depict open ocean boundary fields using continuous or segmented boundary lines set against large areas of oceanic background. The surrounding seafloor context is shown at basin scale to emphasize relative isolation from margins. Field boundaries are not sharply defined, but are inferred through spatial grouping. Within spatial placement classifications, open ocean boundary fields provide contrast to margin-adjacent and peripheral boundary arrangements. This contrast supports clear differentiation between interior and edge-based basin structures. The category functions as a positional grouping rather than a structural description. Standard atlases and digital plate boundary layers apply uniform symbology to boundaries located in open ocean fields. Labels emphasize basin association and general location. These records focus on geographic extent and distribution only. Across institutional datasets, open ocean boundary fields remain stable elements of basin-scale mapping. Their inclusion supports consistent representation of interior oceanic boundary placement. The classification excludes references to temporal variation, activity, or boundary processes. Linear boundary segments refer to plate boundary features mapped as straight or near-straight traces in oceanic boundary datasets. These segments are identified by their geometric simplicity and limited curvature across mapped extents. The classification emphasizes observable shape rather than origin or modification. In boundary geometry, pattern frameworks, linear segments are recorded where boundary traces maintain a consistent directional trend over distance. Orientation may align along north, south, east, west, or oblique axes, depending on basin context. Directional consistency is catalogued as a geometric attribute. Linear segments occur across multiple ocean basins and boundary settings. They appear both as isolated traces and as components of larger boundary networks. Their presence is independent of proximity to continental margins or basin interiors. Mapping representations depict linear boundary segments as continuous lines with minimal angular deviation. Segment length varies from short, localized traces to extended features spanning hundreds of kilometers. Breaks or offsets are recorded as terminations or transitions rather than changes in segment type. Within geometric classification schemes, linear segments are distinguished from curved, arcuate, or segmented boundary forms. This distinction supports systematic categorization of boundary shapes across global datasets. The label applies solely to plan view geometry. Linear boundary segments may occur singly or in parallel sets. Spacing between adjacent segments is recorded where relevant as part of spatial layout. These relationships are noted without interpretive context. Cartographic standards use uniform line styles to represent linear segments, maintaining consistency across atlases and digital layers. Naming conventions typically reference regional placement rather than geometric character. Records focus on location, orientation, and extent. Across institutional datasets, linear boundary segments remain stable elements of geometric inventories. Their classification supports comparative analysis of boundary shapes across oceanic regions. The framework excludes references to formation processes or temporal change. Offset ridge transform patterns describe a recurring geometric arrangement in which linear ridge segments are laterally displaced by intervening transform-aligned segments. The pattern is identified through plan view mapping of oceanic boundary traces and is defined by shape and relative orientation alone. The classification focuses on spatial layout rather than origin or modification. In mapped representations, ridge segments appear as roughly parallel linear elements separated by offset intervals. These intervals are occupied by boundary traces oriented at high angles to the ridge segments. The resulting pattern forms a stepped or staggered configuration across the seafloor map. Orientation is a defining attribute of offset ridge transform patterns. Ridge segments commonly share a consistent directional trend within a basin, while offset segments display a contrasting alignment. The angular relationship between these elements is recorded as a geometric characteristic. Offset magnitude varies among mapped examples. Some patterns show short lateral separations between ridge segments, while others display wider spacing. These differences are catalogued as spatial attributes without comparative ranking. Segmentation is integral to this pattern type. Individual ridge segments are discrete and bounded, with clear terminations at offset intervals. The repetition of offset, segment sequences produces a recognizable geometric motif across basin-scale maps. Offset ridge transform patterns are documented in multiple ocean basins. They appear in central basin regions as well as in areas associated with broader boundary networks. Their distribution reflects mapped geometry rather than basin-specific labeling. Cartographic conventions depict these patterns using connected linear traces with distinct directional changes at segment junctions. Line styles and symbols emphasize continuity and alignment. Records prioritize location, orientation, and segmentation. Within boundary geometry inventories, offset ridge transform patterns provide a standardized category for complex linear arrangements. The classification supports consistent comparison across datasets while excluding formation processes and temporal considerations. Curved trench arcs refer to boundary features mapped as smoothly bending or arcuate traces along oceanic plate boundaries. These arcs are identified through plan view geometry and are distinguished by continuous curvature rather than straight or angular alignment. The classification emphasizes observable shape across mapped extents. In boundary geometry pattern frameworks, curved trench arcs display gradual changes in direction over distance. The curvature may be uniform or variable along a single arc. Radius of curvature is recorded as a geometric attribute, without interpretive context. Curved trench arcs are commonly arranged as long sweeping segments that parallel basin margins or island chains. Their orientation shifts progressively along strike, producing crescent-like or bow-shaped outlines or maps. These forms are catalogued without reference to structural relationships. Segmentation is present within many curved arcs. Individual arc sections may be separated by subtle breaks, overlaps, or changes in curvature. These segments are mapped as connected elements within a single arcuate system. Arc length varies widely among mapped examples. Some curved trench arcs extend for hundreds of kilometers, while others span much greater distances across basin margins. Length is recorded as an extent measure rather than a comparative indicator. Curved trench arcs occur in multiple ocean basins and geographic settings. Prominent examples appear along basin peripheries and in regions with complex boundary networks. Their distribution reflects mapped geometry rather than basin classification. Cartographic representations depict curved trench arcs using smoothly bending lines with consistent symbolization. Lane weight and color emphasize continuity of curvature across segments. Junctions with other boundary forms are shown as spatial intersections only. Within boundary geometry inventories, curved trench arcs constitute a distinct pattern category. The classification supports systematic comparison of boundary shapes across datasets. It excludes references to formation processes, activity, or temporal change. Stepped boundary sequences refer to geometric arrangements in which boundary traces form a series of offset segments connected by short linking sections. These sequences are identified through plan view mapping and are characterized by repeated directional changes along an overall alignment. The classification emphasizes segmentation and angular pattern rather than continuity. In boundary geometry pattern frameworks, stepped sequences display alternating orientations across adjacent segments. Individual segments maintain relatively linear traces, while junctions introduce abrupt lateral shifts. The cumulative effect produces a staircase-like outline on mapped representations. Segment length within stepped sequences varies across examples. Some sequences consist of numerous short segments, while others include fewer, longer elements, separated by pronounced offsets. Segment dimensions are recorded as geometric attributes, without ranking or interpretation. Orientation patterns remain consistent across a given sequence. Primary segments often share a common directional trend, while connecting segments display contrasting alignments. The angular relationships between segments are catalogued as part of geometric description. Stepped boundary sequences occur across multiple ocean basins and boundary settings. They appear in basin interiors as well as along basin margins. Their distribution reflects mapped geometry rather than regional classification schemes. Cartographic representations depict stepped sequences using connected line segments with visible angular transitions. Junction points are shown clearly to preserve segmentation. Symbolization highlights shape and orientation rather than continuity. Within geometric classification systems, stepped sequences are distinguished from smoothly curved arcs and uninterrupted linear segments. This distinction supports systematic categorization of boundary forms across global datasets. The label applies solely to observable plan view configuration. Standard atlases and digital boundary layers maintain consistent depiction of stepped sequences across scales. records focus on location, orientation, and segmentation. The classification excludes references to formation processes, temporal change, or boundary behavior. Intersecting boundary nodes refer to mapped locations where two or more plate boundary traces meet or cross in plan view. These nodes are identified through geometric arrangement rather than categorical assignment or process interpretation. The designation applies to point-like or small area junctions, emphasized in regional and global boundary datasets. In boundary geometry inventories, nodes are characterized by the number of incoming and outgoing boundary segments. Two-segment intersections form simple crossings or junctions. Three-segment intersections form Y-shaped or T-shaped configurations. Higher-order intersections are recorded where multiple segments converge in a compact mapped area. Orientation is a primary descriptor at intersecting nodes. Each connected segment carries its own directional trend as traced on maps. The angular relationships between segments are documented as part of node geometry. Acute, right angle, and obtuse intersection angles all occur in mapped examples. Segmentation at nodes is explicit in many datasets. Individual segments terminate at the node, and new segments begin from the same location. Some representations show short transitional links connecting major segments, creating a small junction zone rather than a single point. Intersecting boundary nodes occur across all major ocean basins. They appear in basin interiors, near basin margins, and along complex boundary networks. Their geographic distribution reflects mapped boundary layout rather than basin classification. Cartographic conventions depict nodes using line junctions, symbol overlays, or annotated points. The symbol set distinguishes intersections from continuous segments, without adding explanatory context. Node labels often serve indexing and cross-referencing functions in digital layers. Within boundary geometry pattern frameworks, intersecting nodes provide standardized reference points for describing network topology. The classification remains limited to shape, orientation, and segmentation at the junction. Formation processes and temporal interpretations are excluded. Continuous boundary chains refer to plate boundary geometries mapped as extended, uninterrupted sequences of connected segments across oceanic regions. These chains are identified through plan view continuity, where individual segments link end to end without major spatial gaps. The classification emphasizes overall shape and alignment rather than categorical type. In boundary geometry pattern frameworks, continuous chains display consistent directional trends over long distances. Minor directional adjustments may occur along the chain, yet the boundary trace remains visually connected across mapped extents. Continuity is recorded as a geometric attribute, independent of segment classification. Chain length varies substantially among mapped examples. Some continuous chains span several hundred kilometers, while others extend across entire ocean basins. Length is catalogued as spatial extent rather than as a comparative measure of scale. Segmentation exists within continuous chains, but does not interrupt mapped linkage. Individual segments may differ slightly in orientation or curvature, while maintaining direct connections at their endpoints. These internal variations are recorded without redefining the chain as discontinuous. Continuous boundary chains occur in basin interiors, along basin margins, and across transitional regions. Their geographic distribution reflects mapped layout rather than basin-specific grouping. Chains may intersect with other boundary forms while retaining identifiable continuity along their primary alignment. Cartographic representations depict continuous chains using uninterrupted linework across maps and digital layers. Junctions, bends, and minor offsets are shown without breaks in symbolization. Line style consistency reinforces the perception of geometric linkage. Within boundary geometry inventories, continuous chains are distinguished from fragmented or highly segmented patterns. The distinction supports systematic description of boundary connectivity across datasets. The classification remains limited to shape, orientation, and segmentation. Standard atlases and digital boundary models maintain consistent depiction of continuous chains across scales. Records prioritize location, alignment, and extent only. References to formation processes, activity, or temporal variation are excluded. Oceanic interfaces refer to mapped plate boundary locations where two oceanic plates meet beneath the ocean. These interfaces are identified through plate pairing records used in global tectonic datasets. The classification is based on plate type on each side of the boundary, rather than boundary behavior. In plate interaction interface frameworks, oceanic interfaces are cataloged as distinct from oceanic, continental, and continental pairings. This distinction is maintained consistently across marine geoscience reference models. The interface label reflects the composition of the interacting plates only. Oceanic interfaces are distributed across multiple ocean basins. They appear in open ocean regions as well as along basin margins associated with island chains. Their geographic placement is recorded without reference to depth variation or regional setting. Mapping datasets represent oceanic interfaces using boundary lines annotated with plate identifiers on both sides. Plate names or codes indicate oceanic classification for each interacting plate. The interface is shown as a linear or segmented trace, depending on mapping resolution. These interfaces may be continuous over long distances or divided into multiple segments. Segmentation is recorded as part of spatial layout rather than as a change in interface type. Junctions with other interface categories are shown as transitions between mapped pairings. Within interface classification systems, oceanic interfaces function as a primary pairing category. They support systematic organization of boundary inventories by plate type. The classification does not include statements about interaction intensity, force transfer, or resulting features. Across institutional datasets and digital plate models, oceanic interfaces remain stable reference elements. Their consistent labeling enables cross-comparison among global maps and regional studies. The interface category remains limited to location and plate pairing. Oceanic continental interfaces refer to mapped plate boundary locations where an oceanic plate is paired with a continental plate beneath the ocean or along continental margins. These interfaces are identified through plate pairing records in global tectonic datasets and regional compilations. The classification is based on the plate type assigned to each side of the boundary line. In interface classification frameworks, oceanic continental pairings are separated from oceanic and continental categories. This separation is maintained across marine geoscience atlases and digital plate boundary layers. The interface label functions as a standardized descriptor of plate composition at the boundary. Oceanic, continental interfaces are widely documented along the edges of ocean basins, adjacent to large continental landmasses. Their mapped placement commonly follows continental margin arcs and offshore boundary traces. Geographic distribution is recorded as part of basin-scale boundary inventories, without reference to temporal variation. Mapping datasets represent oceanic, continental interfaces as boundary lines annotated with plate identifiers on both sides. Plate names or codes indicate the oceanic classification on one side and the continental classification on the other. The interface is shown as continuous or segmented, depending on the dataset's scale and resolution. Segmentation along oceanic, continental interfaces is common in regional maps. Individual segments may vary in orientation and curvature, while preserving the same pairing classification. Transitions to other pairing categories are shown where boundary networks intersect, or where plate type assignments change across mapped junctions. Within plate interaction interface systems, oceanic continental interfaces serve as a primary organizational category for boundary inventories. The category supports consistent indexing, comparison, and cross-referencing among datasets. The classification remains limited to interface location and plate pairing. Across institutional reference models, oceanic continental interfaces are stable elements of global boundary documentation. Symbology and labeling conventions prioritize clear identification of the paired plate types. The category excludes descriptions of force exchange, boundary outcomes, or structural consequences. Multi-plate junction areas refer to mapped locations where three or more tectonic plates meet at a shared boundary region under the ocean. These areas are identified through plate pairing records that indicate multiple plate identities converging at a single geographic location. The classification is based on interface configuration rather than boundary behavior. In plate interaction interface frameworks, multi-plate junctions are distinguished from two-plate interfaces by the number of plates involved. These junctions are recorded as discrete nodes or small zones where several boundary traces intersect. The interface label reflects the complexity of plate pairing at the junction. Multi-plate junction areas occur in various oceanic settings. They are documented in open ocean regions, along basin margins, and near island arc systems. Their geographic placement is catalogued without reference to depth variation or structural context. Mapping datasets represent multi-plate junctions using clustered boundary lines that converge at a point or compact area. Plate identifiers are shown for each adjoining segment to indicate the participating plates. The junction may be depicted as a point symbol or as a small bounded region, depending on map resolution. These areas often connect boundary segments with differing pairings. Each segment retains its own interface classification as it approaches the junction. The junction area records coexistence of multiple interface relationships without prioritization. Within interface classification systems, multi-plate junction areas function as organizational reference points. They support indexing of complex boundary networks and alignment between regional and global datasets. The classification remains descriptive and locational. Across institutional plate models, multi-plate junction areas are stable reference features. Their consistent depiction supports cross-comparison among tectonic maps. The category excludes descriptions of force exchange, boundary outcomes, or dynamic interaction. Ridge, transform intersections refer to mapped interface locations where ridge-aligned boundary segments meet transform-aligned segments under the ocean. These intersections are identified through the spatial pairing of two distinct boundary traces at a shared geographic location. The designation is based on interface configuration and relative alignment rather than boundary behavior. In plate interaction interface frameworks, ridge, transform intersections are distinguished from ridge, or transform junctions by the differing orientations of the connected segments. One segment follows a ridge alignment, or the intersecting segment follows a transform alignment. The pairing is recorded as a discrete interface location. Ridge, transform intersections are distributed across multiple ocean basins. They are commonly documented along extended ridge systems, where transform-aligned segments interrupt ridge continuity. Their placement is recorded in open ocean regions, as well as in areas associated with broader boundary networks. Mapping datasets depict ridge, transform intersections as junction points or short junction zones. Boundary lines of contrasting orientation converge at these locations. Plate identifiers and segment labels are shown to indicate the participating boundary elements without implying interaction outcomes. These intersections often occur in repeated sequences along ridge systems. Each intersection is mapped individually, even when similar configurations recur at regular intervals. The repetition is catalyzed as a spatial pattern rather than as a functional series. Within interface classification systems, ridge transforming intersections function as reference points for organizing complex boundary layouts. They support indexing and segmentation of ridge systems in digital and printed maps. The interface label remains descriptive and locational. Across institutional plate boundary datasets, ridge transform intersections are stable reference features. Their consistent depiction allows comparison among regional and global compilations. The classification excludes references to force exchange, material transfer, or resulting structures. Trench, transform, intersections refer to mapped interface locations, where trench-aligned boundary segments meet transform-aligned segments beneath the ocean. These intersections are identified through the geometric convergence of two differently oriented boundary traces at a shared geographic location. The classification is based on interface pairing and alignment rather than boundary behavior. Within plate interaction interface frameworks, transform intersections are distinguished from ridge, transform, and trench, ridge junctions by the involvement of a trench-aligned segment paired with a transform-aligned segment. Each intersecting segment retains its own alignment classification as it approaches the junction. The interface label reflects this specific pairing configuration. Trench, transform intersections are documented in several ocean basins, particularly along basin margins where trench systems extend laterally and intersect transform-aligned boundaries. Their geographic placement is recorded both near continental margins and in offshore arc-related regions. Distribution is catalogued without reference to basin evolution or activity. Mapping datasets depict trench, transform intersections as boundary junction points or compact junction zones. Trench traces curve or extend toward the intersection, while transform traces approach at contrasting orientations. Plate identifiers and segment labels are shown to indicate participating boundary elements without implying outcomes. These intersections may occur singly or as part of repeated junction patterns along extended trench systems. Each occurrence is mapped individually, even when similar configurations recur along the same boundary network. Repetition is treated as a spatial arrangement rather than a functional sequence. Within interface classification systems, trench transform intersections serve as organizational reference points for complex boundary layouts. They support segmentation and indexing of trench systems in global and regional datasets. The classification remains limited to location and interface pairing. Across institutional plate boundary models, trench transform intersections are stable reference features. Their consistent depiction enables comparison across mapping programs. The category excludes descriptions of force exchange, deformation, or resulting structures. Distributed interface regions refer to mapped areas where plate interactions are represented across broad zones rather than along a single, sharply defined boundary line. These regions are identified in global plate datasets as spatially extensive interface areas that involve multiple adjacent boundary traces or diffuse boundary placement. The classification is based on interface location and plate pairing across an area. In plate interaction interface frameworks, distributed regions are distinguished from linear interfaces by their area of expression. Boundary traces may appear as parallel segments, overlapping lines, or loosely organized networks across a defined region. The interface label applies to the collective area rather than to an individual segment. Distributed interface regions occur in several oceanic settings. They are documented in open ocean environments, along complex basin margins, and near regions where multiple boundary segments converge over a wide spatial extent. Geographic placement is recorded without reference to boundary intensity or interaction style. Mapping datasets represent distributed interface regions using shaded zones, grouped line fields, or clustered boundary traces. Plate identifiers indicate the participating plates across the region rather than at a single contact line. The mapped extent reflects classification chases rather than precise boundary limits. Within these regions, individual boundary segments may carry different orientations or pairing combinations. Each segment retains its own interface designation while contributing to the broader distributed region classification. Transitions to linear interfaces are shown, where boundary traces become more spatially concentrated. Distributed interface regions function as organizational categories in interface inventories. They allow complex or diffuse plate interactions to be recorded consistently across datasets with varying resolution. The classification supports alignment between regional studies and global compilations. Across institutional plate boundary models, distributed interface regions are stable reference features. Their depiction emphasizes location, extent, and participating plates only. Descriptions of force exchange, deformation, or resulting features are excluded by definition. Global plate boundary maps present a standardized depiction of plate boundaries across the world ocean and adjacent land areas. The maps compile boundary traces into continuous line networks suitable for global reference. Boundary lines are commonly differentiated by boundary type through symbol shape, line style, or color conventions. Most global products use geographic coordinate frameworks that support consistent placement across different projections. App versions may be distributed as printed atlas plates, raster images, or vector-based digital layers. Digital products often provide attribute tables that store plate identifiers, segment identifiers, and boundary class labels. Global plate boundary maps typically assign names or codes to major tectonic plates and selected microplates. Plate polygons and boundary lines are paired so that each boundary segment can be referenced to plates on either side. Segment topology is represented through connected nodes and linked linkwork to support network integrity. Legend systems on global maps define the visual encoding used for boundary categories and other reference features. The legend may also specify conventions for uncertain traces, generalized segments, and map scale limitations. These conventions aim for comparability across institutions and editions. Some global map frameworks include multiple layers, such as plate outlines, boundary lines, ridge axes, trenches, and transform traces, each stored as separate feature classes. Coordinate reference system metadata is included to preserve alignment across GIS platforms. Citation metadata and version identifiers are commonly provided for traceability. Global plate boundary maps function as reference baselines for indexing regional studies and for aligning datasets derived from different sources. The maps emphasize consistent placement and consistent labeling. The maps exclude interpretive statements when presented as reference compilations. Ocean basin segmentation grids refer to reference frameworks that divide the global ocean into standardized spatial units for mapping and cataloging purposes. These grids provide a consistent structure for organizing geographic information across basin-scale datasets. The segmentation is geometric and positional rather than interpretive. Segmentation grids are commonly defined using latitude, longitude intervals, equal area tessellations, or hierarchical tile systems. Each grid cell is assigned a unique identifier that supports indexing and cross-referencing. Cell size and shape are selected to balance global coverage with practical resolution. In reference mapping contexts, ocean basin grids are applied uniformly across all major basins. The grid framework does not change with basin morphology or boundary complexity. Basin limits are overlaid onto the grid rather than embedded within the grid definition. Many segmentation systems support multiple resolution levels. Coarse grids are used for global summaries, while finer grids support regional mapping and data integration. Resolution levels are nested to preserve alignment across scales. Ocean basin segmentation grids are often used in conjunction with vector boundary layers. Boundary segments are intersected with grid cells to enable special queries, statistics, and cataloging. The grid itself remains independent of boundary classification. Digital implementations store grids as raster layers, vector polygons, or index tiles within geographic information systems. Coordinate reference system metadata accompanies each grid definition to ensure consistent placement across platforms. Versioning information is commonly included to track updates. Segmentation grids facilitate comparison between datasets produced by different institutions. They provide a neutral spatial scaffold that supports data aggregation and alignment. The framework emphasizes consistency of placement rather than analytical interpretation. Within reference mapping frameworks, ocean basin segmentation grids function as foundational spatial infrastructure. They support systematic organization of oceanographic and tectonic information. The grids exclude assumptions about boundary behavior, temporal variation, or geodynamic significance. Coordinate-based boundary indexing refers to reference systems that assign numeric location identifiers to plate boundary segments using geographic coordinates. This approach enables precise placement and retrieval of boundary information within global mapping datasets. Indexing is based on position rather than boundary behavior or interpretation. In coordinate-based frameworks, boundary lines are represented as sequences of points defined by latitude and longitude pairs. Each point carries an ordered position within a segment, allowing boundaries to be reconstructed consistently across platforms. Indexing schemes preserve point order to maintain boundary geometry. Some systems group coordinate points into indexed segments with unique identifiers. Segment ID link coordinate sequences to attribute tables containing plate names, boundary class labels, and data source references. This structure supports efficient querying and cross-referencing within geographic information systems. Coordinate-based indexing is compatible with multiple map projections. Coordinates are typically stored in a standardized geographic reference system and reprojected as needed for visualization. Metadata specifies the coordinate reference system to ensure alignment across datasets. Resolution varies among indexing systems. High-resolution datasets include dense point spacing to capture detailed boundary geometry, while lower-resolution products use simplified coordinate chains. Resolution choice reflects mapping scale rather than analytical intent. Coordinate-based indexing supports version control and update tracking. Revised boundary positions can be documented by updating coordinate lists while preserving segment identifiers. This allows comparison between dataset additions without altering the overall indexing structure. Within reference mapping frameworks, coordinate-based indexing provides a neutral and reproducible method for boundary documentation. It enables consistent storage, exchange, and integration of boundary data across institutions. The system excludes inference about boundary dynamics, history, or outcomes. Cartographic boundary symbols refer to the standardized visual marks used to represent plate boundaries on reference maps. These symbols encode boundary information through line style, color, pattern, and annotation. The system prioritizes consistency and legibility across map scales and formats. Line style is a primary symbol variable. Solid, dashed, or segmented lines are assigned to distinguish boundary categories or confidence levels. Line thickness may vary to indicate map scale or emphasis without implying physical magnitude. Color conventions are commonly applied to differentiate boundary types or to separate boundary traces from other reference layers. Color palettes are selected to maintain contrast against bathymetric backgrounds and land features. Color assignments are defined in legends to ensure reproducibility. Directional markers and geometric modifiers appear in some symbol sets. Triangles, ticks, arrows, or short perpendicular marks may be placed along boundary lines to denote categorical attributes specified by the legend. These markers are repeated at regular intervals to preserve clarity over long distances. Junction symbols identify locations where multiple boundary segments meet. Nodes may be shown as points, small circles, or emphasized intersections. These symbols support visual parsing of boundary networks without adding interpretive content. Uncertainty and generalization are conveyed through symbol variation. Faded lines, dotted patterns, or bracketed annotations indicate approximate placement or reduced resolution. These conventions communicate mapping limits rather than analytical conclusions. Legends define the full symbol vocabulary. Each symbol is paired with a concise label and usage rule. Legends also specify scale dependencies and symbol precedents where layers overlap. Digital mapping frameworks encode cartographic symbols as style rules linked to attribute fields. Style definitions are stored separately from geometry to allow consistent rendering across platforms. Symbol standards facilitate interoperability among institutional datasets. Cartographic boundary symbols function as a reference language for maps. They emphasize clear identification, consistent placement, and standardized meaning. The system excludes inference about boundary behavior or outcomes. Comparative basin reference sets refer to standardized collections of maps and datasets used to place ocean basins side by side within a common reference framework. These sets are designed to support consistent comparison of spatial layouts, boundary placements, and naming conventions across different ocean regions. The emphasis is on alignment and equivalence rather than analytical interpretation. Reference sets typically include parallel map products for each major ocean basin. Each basin is represented using the same projection type, scale range, and symbol conventions. This uniformity allows basin features to be visually and spatially compared without transformation. Boundary traces within comparative sets are derived from the same source datasets or harmonized compilations. Plate boundary lines, basin outlines, and reference grids are rendered using identical cartographic rules. Attribute fields are standardized so that boundary labels and identifiers correspond across basins. Many comparative basin sets are organized as plate atlases, digital map series, or multi-layered GIS packages. Individual basin layers can be toggled or combined while retaining consistent reference parameters. Versioning information is shared across the set to ensure temporal alignment of source material. Comparative reference sets often include ancillary index maps that show basin locations within a global context. These overview products use the same symbology as basin-specific maps at reduced scale. The approach maintains continuity between global and basin-level references. Metadata plays a central role in comparative sets. Projection details, coordinate reference systems, data sources, and compilation dates are documented uniformly. This metadata supports reproducibility and cross-institutional use. Within reference mapping frameworks, comparative basin reference sets function as alignment tools. They enable structured side-by-side placement of ocean basins under identical mapping assumptions. The sets exclude interpretation, inference, and evaluative comparison, focusing solely on consistent representation. Boundary catalog datasets refer to structured data collections that enumerate plate boundary segments and related reference attributes in a standardized format. These datasets function as inventories rather than interpretive products. Entries are organized to support retrieval, indexing, and cross-referencing across mapping systems. Catalog datasets typically store boundary geometry as vector features linked to attribute tables. Each entry may include a segment identifier, plate identifiers on either side, boundary category labels, and source references. The structure emphasizes consistency of fields and controlled vocabularies. Many catalogs adopt hierarchical organization. Global identifiers group segments by major plates or regions, while local identifiers distinguish individual segments or nodes. This hierarchy supports aggregation and disaggregation without altering underlying geometry. Boundary catalogs often include metadata records that document compilation methods, coordinate reference systems, and version history. Metadata fields allow users to trace provenance and assess alignment between datasets. Updates are recorded through version increments rather than overwriting prior entries. Formats vary across institutions. Common implementations include relational databases, flat files, and GIS-compatible packages such as shapefiles or geopackages. Field naming conventions are standardized to facilitate interoperability. Catalog datasets may incorporate uncertainty flags or status codes. These fields indicate mapping confidence, generalization level, without introducing interpretation. The flags function as descriptive qualifiers within the catalog schema. Boundary catalogs are frequently synchronized with reference maps and digital layers. Map products draw directly from catalog entries to ensure consistency between visual representation and tabulated records. The catalog remains the authoritative index. Within reference mapping frameworks, boundary catalog datasets provide a stable backbone for plate boundary documentation. They support data exchange, archival storage, and systematic comparison across sources. The datasets exclude inference, analysis, and explanatory content, focusing solely on organized reference information. Boundary lines remain as mapped expressions of relative motion beneath the ocean basins. Configurations persist within a broader lithospheric framework, without fixed center or termination. Spatial relationships continue across the same continuous surface.